Today, we're going to learn how to screen print from start to finish. The whole process. It's going to be a lot of fun. This is how screen printing works. You have the screen, which isn't that different from a screen door that you have to avoid bugs getting into the house, but it's just a lot finer. You cover that screen with a photosensitive emulsion, and you basically harden that photosensitive emulsion with a light source. Whatever's covered up when you're burning that screen will still be soft, and the other parts will get hardened. And then you wash it out with water, and you're left with a pretty good stencil, which you can pass ink through with a squeegee. You need one screen for each individual color, so when you're starting off, you want to make sure that you're doing single color prints. It's just easier, and then once you get the hang of a single color print, you can upgrade and start doing multicolor, or even like a CMYK print, or whatever. You can really go crazy with this whole screen printing thing. But for now, to just start screen printing, you're gonna need a couple things. First of all, a screen. You can see through it, so it's basically kind of like a screen door. I don't know if that makes sense, but it has very, very tiny cross sections. You're gonna need a scoop coater. This is to apply the emulsion onto the screen. You don't necessarily need this if you're crafty enough. You can probably use a squeegee and a little bit of just, finesse. You can probably finesse your way onto laying a coat of emulsion onto a screen. But this is what I use. I use AP Blue and Textile Blue by Ecotex. They come pre-sensitized, so you don't have to worry about mixing any diazo into the actual emulsion, and I love it. It's treated me very nicely. You're going to need a printer, specifically an inkjet printer, but you don't need a printer. I don't know if that makes sense. The printer is going to make it easy to make these. These are called transparencies, and they allow some light to go through, and in other parts, it doesn't let light come through. But you can buy transparencies and just paint on them with a Sharpie. If you want to do a hand-drawn design, you can always grab a Sharpie and paint on a transparency paper and use that to screen print. Of course, you're going to need somewhere flat to actually print once it gets to time to printing. So this is a screen printing press, and this is what I use usually. It comes with this palette, which is flat, and you can put anything. This is made for shirts, so you can put a shirt onto it and print on it, and this is where the screen goes. So you just bring down this thing, and you're able to print. The other thing you're gonna need is a squeegee and some ink. And there's a lot of nuances when it comes to actually printing with different kinds of ink. This is Rapid Cure, and it's black. Black is really easy to print with because it just goes through the mesh super easily. It's liquidy, and it's not a nightmare to deal with. White, on the other hand, is very thick, so you want to mix that thoroughly before you actually print. There's two basic types of inks. There is a water-based ink, which this is pitch black ink, and water-based is a nightmare to deal with. If you're not constantly printing, it dries up in your screen pretty quickly, so you need a water bottle to spritz on it so it doesn't dry up. Plastisol ink, on the other hand, doesn't dry up. This one cures at 270 degrees, and this one cures at, I don't see where it says, but I know that since it's water-based, it cures at a lower temperature, because since this has such a high curing temperature, you're gonna need a heat gun or a heat press or a conveyor dryer or a flash dryer. All of those are very valid options. I personally have a heat gun, and I also have a heat press. This Swingman 15 has worked wonders for me. You don't need anything super fancy to do this, to be completely honest. You can get away with just using a heat gun. The only problem with the heat gun is that it's very difficult to make sure to cure the entire print if you have a very big print, which is what we're gonna be doing today, a really oversized print. I've never done anything this big before. I had to get special screens for it. I usually work with 24 by 20 inch screens, and we got some 31 by 24 inch screens. Look at how big this is. This is insane. And here's what I usually work with, a 24 inch screen. Look at how much bigger that is. I'm like so excited to do this print. Screen printing is so much fun, to be completely honest. It is definitely a good hobby to pick up. You're gonna need some blockout tape. The other thing you're gonna need, light source. So this is what I personally use. I find it easier to control the environment if you use a light bulb instead of the sun. Using the sun is an option depending on your emulsion and depending on what you're using. It's always going to be different. Don't take my exposure times for granted in this video, because depending on what emulsion you're using and what kind of light source you're using and what the environment is like in your shop is going to be different. I use this light bulb. It came with a DIY screen printing. I believe it's just a UV bulb, nothing too special. And this is a reptile lamp holder. I don't know if that makes sense, but my brother likes reptiles and I just found it and I started using it. So now let's go do some artwork and degrease our screens. We have to make sure that we degrease our screens before applying any emulsion onto them. We don't want any dust or dirt being in between the fine mesh. It's really important, because if you don't do this, the emulsion won't stick to it and you'll have bad exposures and bad stencils, and it is no fun to deal with this and do this over and over again. So hopefully this video helps you to get that dialed in quickly, you know. This is the general idea of what we're going to be trying to screen print today. That's the mock-up, and I am using Kittle, but I would highly suggest you learn how to use Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Photoshop. Both very good, but Kittle is very nice to like get inspiration and organize your design better and actually mock it up. I'm only going to be printing out this judgment text because that's what I need. I already have screens burnt for the main design. So let's go ahead and get that downloaded as a remove background 300 DPI and download it as a PNG. And then this is just how I like to do it. I like to load it up into Photoshop afterwards. Even though it's not vector based, it's still going to come out good. You need an inkjet printer in order to be able to print on these transparencies, but you don't need a printer in order to screen print. You can always just buy transparencies and draw on it with a Sharpie. Okay, I'm going to try this out, see how it comes out. This is a transparency. One side is kind of sticky and the other one's smooth. So you want it to be printing on the sticky side. The smooth side isn't going to hold any ink on it. There we have the first transparency. It looks pretty good. So now this is the general idea. These are my transparencies, and this is how big the print is going to be. This is a small t-shirt, and the J doesn't like fully come on it, but I think it'll still look good even though it's not fully on there, and parts of the T won't come on it either. But we'll still try it out because this is just a small and it should fit very nicely on mediums and larges and anything bigger. This is going to be fun. I got two screens. I got a 200 mesh count and a 158 mesh count, and since we're going to be doing letters, which is basically a vector, I'm going to use the 158 mesh count. Before we do that, we'll run through some of these chemicals. Plastisol press wash. You actually want Plastisol screen wash. This is for the on press, like cleaning on press, but this will remove the ink once it gets used and it's dirty. Some emulsion remover for when you don't need the screen anymore and you want to reclaim it. You can reuse the screens for as long as they don't break. As long as they're in one piece, you can use them 1,000 times. You know, you can print so many shirts with one screen. And mesh degreaser. This isn't actually mesh degreaser. I bought industrial degreaser and just mixed it 1-to-1, and it works fine. It was much cheaper than getting actual Ecotex mesh degreaser. It works exactly the same. I do have some screens that we're gonna bring up and we're gonna take out and degrease them to get them ready to get some emulsion on them. So let's go do that. This is my little wash booth area. And I have a couple different brush things. One to remove ink, one to remove emulsion, and one to degrease. You want one of each, of course. And this one is the degreasing one. It snowed a lot, so I haven't been screen printing at all for a couple days. A couple weeks, more like it. And we're just gonna degrease all of these. You grab your mesh degreaser. Before you actually put the emulsion on, you wanna degrease these. Very important. So you just spray the whole thing, both sides, and then grab your, whatever this is called, brush, and you just do little circles on it. You want to cover the whole printable area wherever you're going to have emulsion on it. So now I'm just going to let that sit there for a couple minutes. I'm going to do the other ones. You can see that this screen has something that's called a phantom image on it. I used it to print something on it, and the ink stained the mesh. It doesn't mean that there's stuff in the mesh there. So this is my print setup. This is where I actually do the printing. Quick dry these screens and hopefully they'll be dried in about 40 minutes to 30 minutes. This is a fan. I picked this up for $15 at Aldi's once, and it has been a lifesaver. It helps me speed up things quite a bit. So now I won't be able to let all of them dry at the same time, but of course we're focusing on mainly the big ones for right now. So I'm just gonna set these over here for now and let those dry for longer. We printed our transparencies, we degreased our screens. The next step is going to be coating our screens, exposing, washing out. We're gonna actually print. The actual drying of the emulsion is gonna take somewhere between 4 to 8 hours, depending on, you know, random circumstances. Like if I use this fan, it'll probably take 4 hours. If I don't use a fan, I would let it go for like 8 or 9 hours, probably a little bit more. Let's go ahead and just let these screens dry. It should be like 40 minutes or so. These screens have been drying for about 45 minutes to an hour now. I think they're ready to get some emulsion on them, so let's go ahead and do that. So we are now in dark room mode. I switched out the bulb that I usually have for a light safe bulb. I don't know, it came with the DIY kit. You don't necessarily have to do this much like setup for this, but I just like to be on the safe side, and definitely don't do this out in the sun. You can do this with regular bulbs around, but just make sure that once you're done, you pick up and don't leave any emulsion anywhere, because it's gonna be a pain in the ass to remove later if you don't clean it up immediately. It dries up, hardens up, and it's so hard to get off. Regular lights, they're mostly okay as long as you do it quickly, and it doesn't have to be super fast, but just don't leave it sitting around there for more than 5 minutes because it's gonna mess up your screen. This is my scoop coat right there, and I'm gonna get my emulsion. So now this is a difficult part for a lot of people because it's kind of something you get used to the more screens you coat, but it's mostly hard because the technique for the scoop coater is kind of important, you know. You want to go at it at an angle and do it kind of quickly, but we'll go over that here in a second. You want to fill up your coater thing about halfway up. You don't want to do a lot and you don't want to do too little. You want to make sure that it's everywhere. So there we go. So now to just double and triple check that our screens are fully dry, you can touch the area of it where you're not going to be actually screen printing, like right here, and it feels dry right there. So we're good to go. So here is the screen, and here is my scoop. The scoop coater has two sides to it. You want to use the sharp edge usually, but I personally don't really pay attention to that. It doesn't really matter that much. People swear it does, but I don't think it matters that much. You want to hold your screen at about a 30-degree angle and then bring your scoop coater up so that the emulsion makes contact with all of it, and then bring the emulsion up all the way up. And you want to tilt that back and collect the rest of it that's up there. And that's how you get an even coat on a screen. That's a very good coat job right there, if I do say so myself. You want to do a 1-to-1 ratio usually. So you do one pass on the front and then same thing on the back. Make sure that all of the emulsion is making contact with it, and then bring it all the way up. And then once you get up here, you bring it back, let all of the emulsion fall back into the coat, and collect it. You want to set these to dry print side down. So this is the inkwell. This is where your ink is going to go. You want to let this dry facing down like that. I have this contraption right here. I made these. These are just a bunch of little wooden blocks, and I'm going to put them underneath the screen so they're not making contact with the floor. You can see how I set that up to dry right there. It looks like it's touching the floor, but there's a little wood block right there to avoid it from touching the floor. If you have somewhere nicer to set them up, go for it, but that is what I came up with. We'll do this quickly with the light on because fuck it. So now, here is the scoop coat with the emulsion in it. You want to bring it up to here and raise it up to the stopping point that your scoop coater has. And then once all the emulsion is touching on every single part of it, you bring your scoop coater down a little bit and then pull upwards. You don't have to do super strong. You don't do super light. You just do right in the middle. Wait for it to all fall back and then scoop up that little remainder. And then same thing on the other side. Let it make contact. Bring your scoop coater a little bit up and then pull upwards. And then once you get to the top, you let it fall down a little bit and then you scoop that little bit up. So just make sure that you reclaim it. I use a spatula and I just scrape it back into the tub. Of course you can't save all of it, but once I've reclaimed as much as I can, you want to clean this out. Don't leave it in there with all of that emulsion in there because it's going to dry up and it's going to be a nightmare to clean later. You want to take it up and wash it out with some water. This is my makeshift dark room. In a way, this is where I let them dry. So as you can see, they're all stacked up on top of each other and they are drying there. These aren't under the fan, so they're going to take about 8 to 12 hours to fully dry. But these right here are under the fan. The fan is getting them, and that's going to speed it up quite a bit. I think these will be ready to go in about 3 to 4 hours. Nice and dark in here. You can barely see. And I'll turn off those lights over there too to make sure that these don't get exposed while they're drying. That wouldn't be fun. But we'll come back in about 3 to 4 hours and we'll burn these screens and wash them out. So now I know it's still kind of dark in here. These are almost done drying. This one is almost done drying. You can see that it's still, I don't know, once it focuses, there we go. You can see it's still kind of glossy-ish. So this one isn't fully dry yet, and you can hear it too when you tap it. It doesn't really sound like a drum. This one, on the other hand, was a little bit higher up, so the actual fan was hitting it better. This one sounds a lot more like a drum. That's just a little technique I've picked up. I don't know, it might be BS though, to be completely honest. I might be completely wrong. This one feels dry. That's what matters. So this is what I'm gonna do to be able to expose it. I am going to expose it right here on the floor in this black carpet. What I am going to do is that I'm gonna toss a couple pillows on the floor, make sure I turn this light off so it doesn't continuously exposed. You can barely see anything now. The pillows are in fact on the floor, and I'm gonna place the screen on top of it. I'm actually gonna just use one pillow because it looks like the one pillow fits perfectly behind it. This is just to keep it from
actually bending inwards, we don't want it to bend inwards.
And we don't want light to be bouncing off the back.
So now here is the second step. When you're printing words, this is very important. When you are printing words, make sure they read backwards. I don't know if that makes sense, but you'll see here in a second. Oh no, this print might be too big for it. Maybe I can squeeze it in just a little bit more. Ah, shit. This print is gonna be too big. Dang, that sucks. Well, should have checked the measurements beforehand. Maybe the other one I have is slightly smaller. I'll go check.
So here's a nice little tip. If you're having trouble exposing your screens, this will help. I have just a water spritzer. That's all it is. It has water in it. So that way, once I'm done exposing, I can immediately get some water on it and avoid overexposure. My exposure time is 6 minutes and 30 seconds. I have dialed it in. That is what usually works for me, is 6 minutes and 30 seconds. So I set a timer for 6 minutes and 30 seconds. And then I hit start. And I will stand here for 6 minutes and 30 seconds. If I had like some kind of contraption where I could lay it on, just walk away from it, that would be nice. But this is what I'm working with, you know?
Something important about exposing screens is that every emulsion is different and every light is different. So what works for me isn't gonna work for you. You should probably run a couple tests and it will take a couple tries. It will be very frustrating. Don't worry about it. Keep trying. You will dial in that time. Take your time and dial in that time. That was silly. But read your instructions on your emulsion. That will say how long you need to expose it for what kind of light source. Halogens will take seconds and light bulbs like these are going to take minutes.
So now the timer has gone off and we are ready to wash it out.
And this is, again, what I like to do is that I will grab the screen
After it's been exposed, and I'll just lightly spritz it. I'll do both sides. And now, with my finger, I'll just go in little circles, super softly. Nothing too crazy to help break down that emulsion. And you can already see it coming out. I don't know if you can because of the low lighting, but if I turn this on, you can already see that it's starting to come out, which is what we want, but we don't want the light to be on for too long. I'm gonna spritz it one more time, and we will take it outside. You can already see it coming out. Wow. Nice and wet.
So now it's just time to wash out the stencil, which it looks like there was a little bit of something right there that got caught. A nice stencil. There was only one mishap here, and that happened because on my plexiglass there was a piece of dirt that didn't let light come through. So that part right there got exposed as part of the stencil. But I think you can tape it up pretty nicely and it should be okay. And there's also that spot right there that was also dirty. But it looks good. Let's let it dry and then we're...
So now I have this screen that has been exposed. You can see that right there there's a little bit of a mishap, but that can be taped up. Since it's text mostly, maybe there's a little bit of there, but you can hold it up to a light source, and if you can see through it, then it's golden, you know?
As you can tell, it does read backwards, but once you lay it down like that, that reads correctly. So that's important to know. But
yeah, let's wait for that to dry, and then we'll print. I did decide to mix some puff additive into my ink. I did 10%, so 100 grams of white ink and 10 grams of puff additive. This was the first time that I had ever done this, and it was fun. We figured it out, and it's a pretty cool effect. Now, you just got to make sure if you decide to do something like this to really stir your ink up. Even if you're not going to use any, you should probably stir your ink up real good just to make sure that it gets nice and soft and you don't have any trouble with it being too cold and too thick. So now this was the setup. We did it on the floor. I'm using the blockout tape to add it to the sides of the screen in order to make sure that no ink comes through those parts because there's no emulsion on there. I also taped up the T as I said I would, and that little dot that washed out as well earlier. I did do a couple of things wrong while printing. The first thing I did wrong was that I used too low of a durometer on the Squeegee. I used I believe a 65 durometer to do this print, and I would suggest going up to 75 or maybe a 70. That would probably help a lot, especially when you're doing a 156 mesh with white ink. Now, the mesh count is usually standard 156. That's like the gold standard for almost all prints. The higher the mesh count, the more detail you're going to be able to get out of the actual print. But the higher the mesh count, the less ink is going to go through the print. So usually what you want to do is go for a higher durometer for lower mesh counts and a lower durometer for higher mesh counts. I don't know if that really makes a lot of sense, but the mesh count is basically how many cross sections there are per square inch on the screen. So in 1 inch of a 156 mesh count, there are 156 cross sections. The good thing is that we did get the positioning right. So after a couple wiggling around and getting it right, I started bringing down the ink. In hindsight, I should have laid down more ink. I don't think that's enough ink to actually start off with. I would be a little bit more generous with it. But you can see that I'm flooding the screen, which I'm definitely flooding it a little bit too hard. We don't want it to push through the screen just quite yet. We want it to push through once you're clearing it. But the ink wasn't agreeing with me. It wasn't covering the whole thing. So that's me not following my own advice on mixing your ink properly. It just, it just happens. You get too excited and you jump a step. But there we go. We're clearing the screen off, clearing the ink. I mean, we're just pushing it off the printable area to make sure that it really goes through and gets onto the shirt. One of the big problems with this print is that it's on an awkward area to actually print on. So what I'm going to be doing is that I'm going to get a little bit of help from my girlfriend's dad. He knows how to, work with wood. And he's gonna cut out a special piece so I can stick the sleeves through to be able to print on it and it being completely flat, because those, not only those seams are in the way, also the seams on the other side of the shirt and the fabric on the other side. So you can tell that the J didn't clear at all, but the T didn't clear that well either, but the middle part kind of did clear pretty good. That's just because it was so much flatter in the middle, and those two areas have a bunch of seams on the left and on the right. And now I'm just going at it with a heat gun. I'm trying to make sure that I heat it up to 260 degrees. And since it's puff ink, you don't want to go too far over 260 degrees because it will crumble. It won't be nice later on, and it won't be able to go through the washing machine. If you look very closely, you can actually see the puffing. It's a pretty cool thing, and I've enjoyed working with this specific kind of ink. It's okay though. Well, that didn't have sound. Hopefully I put a voice over it. That sucks. But this is a previous print that I've done before, and you can see how much cleaner it is. That's just because I used an actual palette and the surface was perfectly flat. There wasn't anything underneath it. So the problem with this one is that there was t-shirt underneath the t-shirt. So what I would personally do to make this print better would be to make some kind of like wooden thing to incorporate onto my printing press, or find a way to get this part to hang like this and then print on it while it's hanging like that, and you can see through the neck here, my arm is right there. So that's kind of what I would do, is make some kind of palette where I can print on to this arm like that, to the back like that. Because the t-shirt was behind it, there's a lot of spots that didn't fully catch ink, and there's spots that got more ink, so it made an inconsistent print. But the puff print is very interesting. I've never used it before. It didn't puff up as much as I expected it to, but I assume if I add more puff additive, it will actually really puff up. It's pretty cool. Let's try it on.
Yeah, but I don't know if it's as much as you wanted to.
There is how it looks like. My mic isn't on me. There it is. And I'm still deciding whether I'm going to put that graphic here or if I'm going to put the graphic underneath the text.